Greetings, welcome back to our study on Mark's Gospel. Today we are in Mark chapter 13. Now, I'm going to try to take this whole chapter at one go because I think it's important to understand Jesus's train of thought in this passage. Now, we must remember that Jesus is coming out of the temple after he has had long and unproductive discussions with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the temple leaders. He has confronted each of those groups, and each of those groups has in some way rejected him. So that provides a very important foundation for what Jesus is going to say in this passage, because his disciples walk out and they notice the construction of the temple. Now, Herod had begun to build this temple during his reign, or rebuild this temple during his reign, and it was a magnificent edifice. It was a huge structure made with massive stones that would have inspired people's imaginations. It was a monument to human achievement, as we like to say. So it is understandable that the disciples are impressed by the size and the scope of the temple. And they ask Jesus about it. And Jesus takes this opportunity to talk about the temple's destruction. Now, the temple's destruction in Jesus' mind is directly built on the confrontation and the conflict he just had with those who run the temple. So we cannot divorce this and Jesus' statements about the temple's destruction from the leadership who is occupying the roles of power within the temple hierarchy and the temple structure. So Jesus starts to talk about the temple being destroyed, and his disciples are understandably nervous, and they question him, when's this going to happen? When is this temple going to be destroyed? Because in their line of thinking, Jesus as the Messiah is not coming to destroy the temple. Jesus is coming to take over the governance of the temple. He is coming to fulfill and continue the cultural worship that they have always known. That would be how they would expect Jesus to operate. Jesus operating differently is not on their radar. So the idea of the temple being destroyed is really not something they're prepared for. But Jesus comes in and he begins talking about the idea of staying vigilant. And he tells people, stay vigilant because there are going to be false prophets come. There are going to be wars and rumors of wars. There are going to be earthquakes and other natural disasters. You are going to be persecuted, and families are going to be divided. That's the first 13 verses of this section. So Jesus talks to the disciples about man-made or human-caused catastrophe, natural catastrophe, catastrophe that specifically deals with the church and believers, and catastrophe within family. And he says to each of us, be vigilant because these things are going to happen. But what he says here is very important. He is not saying that these are the signs of the end. He is not saying that these events are precursors to the end. There's some birth imagery here, and a lot of people like to talk about how these are the contractions before labor. And that's not true. These are more like Braxton Hicks contractions, false labor. The idea that, yes, we see there's pregnancy. Yes, we know that things are happening, but to the vigilant person, to the person who is well informed and is staying vigilant, these are obviously false labor. Don't worry about these things. That's what he is saying. He is not telling us that these are signs of the end. He's telling us these are things that are going to happen, and that the vigilant person isn't going to be terribly concerned with, because they know that this is just part of life. So when prophets come today and they say things like the solar eclipse is a sign of the end, or the war in Israel is a sign of the end, and there have been numerous people saying these things, they're not telling the truth. They are not staying vigilant to what Jesus is saying. He's saying the exact opposite of how some people try to interpret this. So he wants us to say, well, this is part of the way the world works. I understand that. I'm still going to stay vigilant. I'm still going to be waiting, but I'm not going to be really worried about these issues. These are just these are just normal everyday parts of life, even if they are somewhat extreme sometimes. So then he goes on to talk about what in older translations was called the abomination of desolation. This is a really difficult passage. Verses 14 and following are somewhat difficult because we don't know exactly what Jesus was referring to. And this is where the transition is. He says, hey, when you see this, then you should worry. Don't worry about the natural disasters. Don't worry about human war. Don't worry about being persecuted. These are all part of life. But when you see this event, then you start to worry. That's when you should leave. That's when you should get away, because that's when the chaos in Jerusalem is about to begin. Now, we don't know what Jesus was referring to. Mark just says, let the reader understand, but he doesn't tell us. In fact, there might be some truth to the idea that Mark himself does not know what Jesus is talking about. Mark might be saying that Jesus's words are ambiguous or veiled to him because he doesn't know, but hopefully when it happens, you as the reader will understand. That's probably not the case, but it's possible. It's more likely that Mark is saying, hey, when you see the sacrilegious event that reminds you of when Antiochus Epiphanes IV sacrificed a pig in the temple, that is what you should be looking for, because that is going to spark off this war. So there is a lot of debate. We don't know exactly what Jesus meant here. And so there's no way for us to properly understand the conflict that Jesus is expecting and anticipating. He's going to say that in those times there's suffering like never before. This again is hyperbole. We understand that this is hyperbole. It is used in the Bible all the time to talk about great suffering. And there was when the temple was destroyed and when Judah fell, or Israel fell in 70 AD. There was also great suffering nearly 70 years after that during the Bar Kokhba rebellion, when the Romans actually completely obliterated the city of Jerusalem and forced all Jews to leave the area we know as Palestine or Israel. So there is a sense in which we can say there's great suffering, but we should also be a little hesitant because Jesus is using some level of hyperbole. He wants us to understand the hyperbole, and if we miss it, we're missing part of the point. He's simply saying that there is great suffering, there's great tribulation connected to the destruction of Jerusalem, and that when it happens, you don't want to be anywhere near that. So that is that whole part is really, it's understandable in the idea that there's suffering and that this is going to be a bad time, but that whole paragraph starting in verse 14 and ending in about verse 20, we can't talk a lot about it because he omits a major detail, or at least we don't have a major detail, and that is, what is this abomination that he says that's the sign you have to actually look out for, not these other things that everybody else is going to talk about, but that one. So we can't really understand that too well, but it is hopefully apparent to Jesus's disciples. That I'm sure he probably went into more detail with them, but either they forgot the detail or for whatever reason they didn't include it in this story. We don't know, but that detail is lost. It also doesn't really matter to us because the destruction of the temple was 1950 years ago. It's not something that's current to us. So then he goes on, and starting in verse 21, that there's going to be all these people who say, well, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Christ, I am this chosen one anointed by God. The idea, again, is that people are going to think that they have special insight from God. But you who are vigilant will know that they do not have special insight from God. These individuals do not have the message that God wants you to have. And you will know that because they are saying things that are counter to what Jesus has said. So, as we are walking through this passage, we have noticed what Jesus has said and what Jesus has not said. And when we hear people who are prophets or even false messiahs saying things that are counter to this message, like that they know when the end of the world is going to happen, we are told not to listen to them because they are obviously false and misleading. Now, verse 24 kicks off a different line of thought. And this verse has very clear allusions back to the book of Daniel and other prophetic literature. This is poetic language. This is highly poetic language that is meant to connect Jesus's words to these other books that we call apocalyptic. That is, they are revelatory. They are taking something that is hidden from normal view and they are making it more accessible to us. They are taking what is behind the scenes and bringing it forward. So this language of the sun and the moon being darkened, this is hyperbole. This is not factual or not literal. It is not. Does not mean that there's an eclipse. It does not mean that there is physical darkness. This is hyperbolic language to show that the world around is crumbling. It is designed to show in some way the subservience of our world to God, not hyperbolic or not literal factual language. This is something that we have to identify in the words. Jesus is here specifically drawing on the prophet Daniel. He is talking about it in a very talking about that book in a very specific way. He is not saying this is an end of the world. Again, this is something that he is answering specifically where the disciples asked him, when will the temple be destroyed? He's still answering that specific question. When will the temple be destroyed? He has given them the answer. When you see the abomination, run. When you see that, then you know the temple is about to be destroyed. Now, this language about the Son of Man or the human one or the Son of Adam, I'm not sure how your translation puts it, but this figure from Daniel chapter 7 comes down. So many Christians want to interpret this as Jesus' return. And so they missed the point. In fact, this has become a very important point for proving the Bible wrong, too. And again, it misses the point because scholars and even those kind of more lay dissenters from the Bible and Christian fundamentalists will align on this passage, and they will say this is all connected to Jesus's physical return. And they say this, well, the people who are again or more of an atheist bent will say, well, look, Jesus predicted his return in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed, and it didn't happen. So we know he's false. The more fundamentalist Christians are going to interpret this and say, this is all in the future at a third temple that hasn't been built yet. And so it hasn't come to pass yet. Neither of those interpretations, though, reads what Jesus is saying. And one of the keys to understanding this is verse 26. And that is the third person plural pronoun, they. They will see the human one coming. And scholars like R.T. France have done a great job fleshing this out far more than I could. But what this is saying is, in the destruction of the temple, the people who have not understood Jesus, well, I should be more clear, the Jewish people who are alive at that time will then understand that Jesus has been glorified. Coming in the clouds does not mean coming to earth. In Daniel 7, this human one, this son of Adam, this son of man, does not come from earth or from heaven to earth in the clouds. No, this individual ascends to heaven in the clouds to receive glory and authority from the Ancient of Days, that is God. So Jesus is saying, when these individuals see that the temple has been destroyed, they will understand that I have authority and power. He is not saying that he is going to return. He is not saying that he is coming in the clouds at this point or rapturing anybody or anything like that. He's saying these individuals, they, not you, again, he's only talking to his disciples. So if he was making a statement about his return, especially since he's going to say specifically, this generation won't pass away, he would say you. He would imply some way that this is believers. He doesn't do that. In fact, he implies the exact opposite, that these are the people who don't believe in him, and they are going to be the ones who now recognize that he was right all along, because God has allowed the temple to be destroyed in a way that shouldn't happen if temple authorities, who he has just argued with, are actually doing what God says and what God wants. What Jesus is saying is, these people who I've just had conflict with, the reason I'm having conflict with them is because they are pushing against what God wants, and they are misusing the temple. So in the end, the temple will be destroyed. You'll know when the time is right. It will be destroyed, and in that moment, they will know that I have spoken the truth. And then he then uses this to transition into a parable. Okay, so he's laid out all of that, and then he says, learn this from the parable of the fig tree. You'll know how to understand the time when you start understanding. You learn the fig tree. So the branch becomes tender, you'll see leaves, and then you'll know summer's coming. Why? Because we know how a fig tree works. So when you start looking for the way God works, you will start understanding the times. You'll start understanding what's going on. You'll see that these wars, that these famines, that these earthquakes, all these other things, this persecution, they don't mean anything. That's the way the world works. God's trying to change the world. When you see the temple desolated or disgraced, then you'll know the temple's going to be destroyed. And when the temple is destroyed, these people will come to know that I was right. But you already have known that because you have kept watch. You have been vigilant. Verse 32. So after he said all of this, he's used the parable. So he has transitioned. 31 kind of closes out that thought. Heaven and earth will pass away, but these words, they won't pass away. That closes out the thought on the temple. So that's what those first 31 verses, they close out that's one segment. Jesus then reminds his disciples, listen, nobody knows the day or the hour when this is going to happen. Not even me. I don't even know when this is going to happen. I've just told you the signs for what's going to happen. And again, note the difference between how the world works and an actual sign of the temple's destruction. And then note what the temple's destruction means. Very important. Keep watch, keep vigilant. Don't let people take you in and make you think that the world is ending or that something else bad is going to happen because of this sign or that sign when they don't know God's plan any more than I do. And I don't know when this is going to happen. So if somebody is trying to tell you that they know things about a timeline, they're flat wrong, and you shouldn't listen to them. The idea is that, again, another parable, the idea is that you are just servants. You are like a doorkeeper. You don't know when the homeowner is going to return. That's not your job. What's your job? To stand at attention by the door in case you are needed. Because if you are needed, then you need to be present. Your job is not to question when you're going to be needed. Your job is not to say, this means that the homeowner or somebody else is coming. Rather, you are meant to keep the door. And if somebody shows up, your job is to let them in or deny them access. Stay alert. It is not, this is reading too much into it to say that this parable is Jesus' second coming and that all these events portend Jesus' second coming. That is the exact opposite of what Jesus is saying here. He's saying, you're not going to know what's going on. Your job is just to do your job, to stay awake, to keep watch, to proclaim the gospel the way Jesus has taught us, not to worry about when things are going to happen. That's the message of Mark 13. That also closes out the Tuesday that closes out the Tuesday of Holy Week. So we've kind of stretched that out. It's 2.5 chapters on that Tuesday. That was a very eventful and busy day, especially for Mark. So next week we're going to get into Mark 14 and Jesus' beginning of the preparations for his Last Supper, and just how Jesus spent Wednesday of Holy Week. So as always, if you have questions or comments or you want to tell me what you're learning in this passage, I would love to hear those. If you want to get a hold of me, we can have a little more private or detailed conversation about some of these passages, especially if they don't make sense to you. And until we meet again, God bless.